and welcome to Mindful. My name is Dr. Stan Berman. I'm the Vice President for Academic Affairs at William James College. Mindful is a series of conversations with the William James College faculty about their scholarship, their research, and their applications in psychology and counseling. I'm really very happy to have a chance to have a conversation with you, Dr. Susan Powell.
Thank you, Stan. Glad to be here.
Thank you, thank you. And there's, I think, a number of topics we could explore. I thought it would make sense to talk about the first generation college student.
Sure.
Throughout higher education at both the undergraduate and the graduate level, the good news is we're seeing an increasing number of first generation college students. You've really become the person here within our college who's been most thoughtful and most engaged with this group.
Thank you.
Certainly, and I thank you because it's been very important.
Yeah.
Could you say a bit about who these students are?
Sure, yeah. So, you know, when we think about first generation college students, there's, I think, a number of ways to think about it, but I think that a more dominant sort of definition of that are students who have nobody else in their family, particularly their parents, have gone to college. Though I think there is some wiggle room for people who have a parent who has an associate's degree. So that's how we define it here. So if you have a parent who has a 2-year degree, you still sort of count, so to speak, as a first generation college student. But people who come from families where parents had 4-year degrees don't typically count as first generation college students. At the same time, with the sort of discussion support groups that we're doing here, I think it really is important to look at how the person self-identifies. So let's say that somebody grew up maybe in a single parent family with their mother, and their mother went to college much later in life, but that person, while they were growing up, didn't have anybody in their family that had gone to college. I think we would certainly welcome them into that group. In terms of thinking about sort of who they are, in terms of what kinds of specific kinds of issues or concerns they might have, I think one of the ways that I like to think about it is in terms of the forms of capital that people might be exposed to growing up. So a lot of times when people think about social class, they think just about money. And while economic capital is important, that's not the only piece that sort of contributes to our understanding of social class. So we can also think about social capital and cultural capital as well. And social capital sort of refers to what kinds of connections you have that would enable you to have more access to information or social power or resources, whereas cultural capital refers to what kinds of knowledge or experience you have with things like literature and the arts and things that become important when you're moving in more, professional situations or professional circles or in higher education. So a lot of times, people who are first generation college students have relatively less access to all three of those forms of capital: economic capital, social, and cultural. And as a result, that can lead to them feeling like outsiders in higher education, feeling like they don't quite fit in.
It's helpful to think about the difference of how they are perceived,
Right.
how they think they're perceived,
Exactly.
and then what their internal experience is.
Right, right. And we recently started here these discussion groups for first generation college students. And it's been very interesting because there have been a lot of faculty and staff who want to come to the groups who aren't first generation, and they want to be there to support. But I think at the end of spring semester, we had a few students ask, well, can we just have the students there this time, just the first generation students? And they had a really wonderful conversation. I think that a lot of what, and I myself, as you know, I think, am a first generation college student.
Yes.
And so that's part of my passion for this, of wanting to provide a place where people can have a chance to talk about these things and feel seen and heard in a way that they maybe haven't experienced before. And I think that they're really getting that in these conversations that we're having. And I'm thinking about, I teach diversity, difference, and inclusion here in the counseling program, and I'm thinking about in the fall, one of my students in class who is a first generation college student also is a veteran. And that's another interesting thing, that a lot of people who are enlisted members in the service tend to come from tend to be first-generation college students. And I don't want to say all of them, but I think it's like 85% or something. So when we have a lot more veterans coming in to higher education, there's also a greater chance that many of them will be first generation as well. But this man was talking in class, and I think he stated it very well, speaking about sort of both pride and sometimes shame about being first generation. And so I think you find that too. And thinking about, well, what happens? Why is this something important that we need to talk about? I think that people who are first generation college students experience some sense of being different from their family. Some research shows that people may have a sense of feeling alienated from and by their families as they become more educated. And I think it really sort of relates back to, again, we live in a society where there's this myth of upward mobility, right? So everybody tends to buy into, or most people tend to buy into, that anybody can get ahead if they're smart enough, if they're capable enough, if they're motivated enough. But the reality is that many people are those things and they don't manage to get ahead. I think about my own parents, for example, who worked extremely hard in their lives but never rose out of a working class status. So I think that, the idea that people can easily move from one class to the other is really a myth. So I think it can be very complicated for first generation students in a sense that they don't quite belong. I remember reading this poem years ago, and it just really struck me. This woman was talking about being in a professional conference, and she was also a first generation college student. And she presented at the conference, and afterwards she found herself thinking, like, she saw people cleaning up after the conference, and she thought, that's the role I should be in this conference. I should be the one cleaning up. There was never an expectation that I would be where I am today. So, yeah, does that make sense?
It makes a great deal of sense. I was thinking about the idea of shame.
Yes.
And I'm thinking, and you suggested this, that there's the potential shame within your family that now you're too big for your britches,
Right.
that you're a big shot, you're no longer respectful towards our family. But then also the shame within the college of, do I belong here? Am I an imposter? Am I perceived as belonging?
Right. And I think that's a really good point. But I also want to say, I don't think it's just shame. I think
Yes.
that shame or embarrassment or
Yes.
stigma can be there.
Yes.
But I think there can also be this very strong sense of pride in
Yes.
terms of look at what I've accomplished, and nobody was helping me. Right?
Yes.
Nobody paid for my education. Nobody helped me get into this school. Nobody helped me with my application or my FAFSA even.
Yes.
Right? So I think that it can be sort of both. But I do think, and I think that the thing is that it ties in both with that myth of upward mobility, but also this notion that the United States is a classless society.
Yes.
And so while it's not a caste system or a very strict class system in that people can't move between classes, the reality is that both upward and downward mobility are pretty rare in our country. Most statistics suggest that it's probably about 10% of people that experience upward mobility, and most of them, or maybe a larger percentage of them, are white. So there's the ways in which I think racism also comes into play with that. So that people oftentimes, in an unexamined way, make assumptions about somebody's social class based on their race, right? So they might see again, Black or African American students in higher education and assume that, they've struggled to get here, they don't have family members who have gone to college, when in fact they may come from, professional families that, for many generations back have been middle or upper middle class. But then again, the other perception being that white students obviously come from educated families. So I think, again, there's a lot of unexamined bias that exists around social class, and because of that, I think it makes that experience harder for first generation college students.
So you and I both know very well that having people become more aware of their biases and their filters and their unstated attitudes
Right.
is very daunting work.
Yes.
But if you were tasked with working with your faculty colleagues about class issues, how might you think about even
That's a great
beginning
question.
that?
Yes, are you asking me to do that?
I may be.
Yeah, yeah. That's a really great question. I think that the first thing is educating them, like we talked about these different forms of capital, to help them think about what social class is. It's not just socioeconomic status, but it's broader than that. So looking at social and cultural capital as well. I think looking at sort of the cultural components of social class, so the differences in things like where people travel, foods that they eat, their taste in furniture or art, all of those things come into play, but again are often not really acknowledged in any way. I think it would be important to help faculty look at how that impacts the students that we see, so that the notion that some students, so for example, in the United States, our public educational systems are sort of tax-based. So where somebody lives, depending on how much money people have in the community, impacts the quality of education that they have access to. You might also find in an affluent school district that students are getting prepped to do college entrance exams like the ACT or the SAT, whereas in a lot of more poor and working class schools, they don't have access to that kind of stuff. So it sort of ensures, or better ensures, social class reproduction. So I think that how that translates into university, and certainly William James College, is my peers needing to be aware of they may not have been exposed to opportunities to develop their writing skills as much as students who went to more affluent school systems and or private liberal arts schools where they were asked to write a lot. Right. So I think that being aware of how that might impact, but also being thoughtful about not having that expectation that if somebody is a weaker writer, that they are first generation, or if they are first generation, that they're going to be a weaker writer, but sort of being aware of that could be a possibility and that could be why. So those are the things I would probably want my colleagues and faculty peers to think about, and also to help them to think about social class separate from race, to not always connect those things in a way that sort of sees all people of color as coming from poor or working class backgrounds.
I'm going to ask a couple questions and think about whether these questions will be comfortable to answer.
Sure.
I want to respect the confidentiality, the privacy of the students
Sure.
who are meeting with you.
Yes, sure.
I'm curious about two things that I wonder if you can go up 3 levels and comment on.
Right.
One would be other themes about their experience as graduate students. And the follow-up to that is, do you feel that there's some specific asks? Like, I wish the faculty here would do X.
I think that a lot of students talk about their families, and particularly their parents, not fully grasping what they're doing or why they need to go on for a master's or even a doctoral degree.
Okay.
I think very old research from the 1970s by these authors named Sennett and Cobb, and they talked about this notion of parents whose children got ahead, and this was based on interviews they did. All of their participants were white at the time, and I think all male actually, but still I think very interesting findings that I have relevance even today, that they found that the parents talked about what they framed as a sense of sacrifice and betrayal, that these parents felt like they had sacrificed a lot for their kids to get ahead, but then they felt betrayed by the success that they had. I often use the terms pride and resentment, and that's been my own personal experience as well, that there's pride but also resentment about, well, you've sort of left us behind. And I think the other theme that a lot of the students talk about is their parents and family members not really asking them what they're doing, not really sort of asking for more information about their job activities, and I don't know that that's so much about disinterest as it is about, again, there's no research on this, but I think there are some complex underlying psychological dynamics at play that impact people not asking about that. I think it taps into, again, maybe at an unexamined unconscious level, but taps into a sense of inadequacy. Like, you've gotten ahead like this, but I didn't, so what does it say about me?
Well, I'm really appreciative that you've taken on this group here at the college. I think these folks are much less visible. Their journey has more challenges, and they need our attention. They need us to be thoughtful about what's going to facilitate their growing sense of confidence and competence.
Yes. I was thinking about this notion of internalized class conflict. And again, these writers, Ryan and Zachary, wrote about this in the 80s and 90s, but this notion that when you experience upward mobility, again, we tend to think of upward mobility as being uniformly positive. And mostly it is, because if you experience upward mobility, you have more access to social power and social resources and so forth. But there is a cost that comes with it as well. And a lot of first-generation college students, and even later into their careers, such as my situation, might talk about this experience of internalized class conflict, where even though we don't think about it this way in our society, classes really are pitted against each other. And there's this great PBS video called People Like Us, Social Class in America. And I show it in my diversity class, and I asked the students to pay attention to, there's this white man in the video who's shown a couple of times, and he's a plumber. And he talks about his interactions with guys who come on his site in suits and ties and so forth. And you can hear sort of the antagonism in his voice, right? So I think that there is this sort of unrecognized, unexplored antagonism between social classes in our society, but because there's also this myth that we're a classless society, we don't really explore that. But for somebody who experiences upward mobility, you then sort of embody or embrace both of those social classes, right?
Yes.
So it's like you still have your poorer working class roots, but you also now have this middle class or professional class that you belong to as well. So I think how that's another way in which it might relate to our faculty and what they might need to be aware of is that a first-generation college student might be much less likely to reach out and ask for help. And again, I'm speaking in generalities here.
Of course.
That's not going to be true across the board.
Of course.
But it's something important to pay attention to, I think.
This has been a really informative, illuminating
good.
conversation.
Great, good.
I'm very grateful.
Thank you, Stan.
And I wanted to ask if there a final parting word, is there a final reflection?
I think that it's important to keep in mind, because some of the earlier research, I mentioned Elizabeth Higginbotham earlier, she had found in, I think she had done like 200 interviews with both white and black women from both working class and middle class families, and what she found was that the women that got the most encouragement to go to college and most support while they were there were African American middle class women. And the women who got the least amount of encouragement to go to college and the least amount of support were white working class women. So I think there are ways in which we need to explore this more and study it more. And again, always keep in mind individual differences, but also think about sort of racial and cultural differences that might come into play, which I think really stem from the systemic institutionalized racism that exists in our society that then impacts some groups being very supportive of their children going to college, even if they come from poor working class backgrounds.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Yeah.
Susan Powell.
Thank you, Stan.